Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And last year, by sheer coincidence, during Pride Month, I wound up talking about the Dicks on this series, one of the first notable queercore acts and widely cited for pushing gay and progressive themes into hardcore punk in the mid-'80s. And that kind of got me thinking, well, I am kind of a day late for this to properly coincide with Pride. Why don't I buck the system and do the same thing for this series this year, but for underground hip-hop? Find one of those LGBTQ acts that might be long forgotten. Well, if anything, this was as challenging of an effort to track us down as it was discovering the Dicks and finding information about them last year. Because if you thought queer themes in hardcore punk were transgressive in the 80s, they were damn near heresy in underground hip-hop near the turn of the millennium. Just like hardcore punk, we are talking about a male-dominated scene, but it was also a space where the homophobia, it flowed freely, including from some underground stalwarts. I mean, they had a hard enough time accepting women into the party, let alone queer acts, and that tended to be a common prejudice, be you black or white. In fact, it was often framed as a defensive projection of masculinity, not just by young, immature guys scared of catching the gay, but also by black men who perceive society's fetishization of them as boiling them down to their sexual traits and nothing else. And if that sexuality was not emphasized in a way that fit with society's expectations, they might be coded as queer or gay. And that's not even touching on the pseudo-spiritual and religious dimensions that had no tolerance for queerness, but also showed up pretty consistently in underground hip-hop. So I'll admit it, I honestly did not expect to find any acts who came out in this era who openly identified as gay or bi or trans or queer, especially not black men. And yet I did. In the year 2000, a few PhD students at Stanford met and expressed some frustration with the spoken word poetry's community's ostracization of their blackness and queerness. And while the core trio, Juba Kamlamka, Tim T. West, aka 25%er, and Philip Atiba Goff, aka LSP, they had experienced some solo success there, they were annoyed at the lines a presumably conscious community was drawing around them. And they saw the opportunity to push some buttons on masculinity, color, and sexuality in their music. Take a harder, deconstructionist tone to the homophobic content that was all over hip-hop, mainstream and underground. So they began creating compositions that would become the groundwork of their 2001 breakthrough, recruiting a couple other guests and producers along the way, a project that's widely considered one of the genesis points of queer hip-hop. Hey, it might have started as a parody, but it morphed into something more. That's right, we're talking about BourgieBohoPostPomoAfroHomo by Deep Dickollective, and this is Resonators. So, okay, there are a few things I want to preface about this project. Namely that you can tell on some level a parody and deconstruction is on display because of how our MCs are keenly aware of how gay and bi black men were seen within culture, especially hip-hop. So they're also not afraid to shy away from some pretty explicit descriptions of gay hookup culture and sex, with the foreknowledge that it will shock some less progressive audiences at the time. Hell, in some hip-hop circles I can see a lot of this as being perceived as shocking now, even with the success of Tyler the Creator or Frank Ocean or Kevin Abstract. And as such, a lot of work is going into the reclamation of slurs and homophobic language and framing. And the biggest coup is that the group that they pull, they highlight just how much gay culture and black hip-hop culture fall along common lines of oppression, or even just common ground in general, specifically around perceptions of masculinity and power. Although given that we're also dealing with academically minded MCs, they don't have a lot of kind words for capitalism and how it split apart hip-hop culture throughout the late 90s either. But this also means, just like Kill from the Heart by the Dicks last year, this is not an album that abides by modern standards of politically correct language. Hell, the group they even got some backlash in queer circles in that day. And it also sadly translates to Writer's Retreat, where one of the punchlines is your hyper-aggressive rapper type that they are protesting against is flirting with a trans girl. And given that we are talking about some highly educated guys, that's a line of attack you'd think they'd know better than to avoid making the trans woman the punchline. But while I'm also kind of disappointed with that, I'm not really all that surprised that wasn't considered. From all accounts, this was an album that was cut out of frustration and casual sessions between a couple young guys where they would just flow their asses off. So I'm not sure how much this was curated or second-guessed. Probably a similar reason why they included the which featuring so much stuttering, which isn't really a gimmick because member Tim T. West actually does have a speech impediment where he did stutter, but it's also not a moment I'm inclined to revisit on the album, especially as everyone on the track tries to affect it, and it does start coming across a bit gimmicky. And on that point, for as much as they might preface the album by saying that it's not that deep, it's also one of those cases where really talented MCs and slam poets, they're gonna flow in double and triple time, and you had better keep up. And they absolutely have the post-grad problem of assuming everyone understands their reference base and language. And I need to emphasize this. While I could properly keep pace, and they're right that many of these songs are simpler than the language implies once you decode them, without the lyrics captured anywhere online to reference, it makes it a pretty tough sit, especially when it suffers the conventional underground hip-hop problem of the era being too long and short on song structures. Hell, to some casual listeners, you might think you're just listening to extremely good, but otherwise straight MCs before you catch some of the references, which is part of the point, and likely help them get through to the audience who didn't expect quality bars, but just a gimmick. And Dickollective emphatically is not just a gimmick. All these guys are serious MCs, and they can spit their asses off. And really, you can make the argument with cuts like the fashion-conscious Cologne on Funk or the incredibly tight wordplay of Oxymoronicon. The group is just at their best existing in the space of underground hip-hop while being queer or LGBT. Proof in action that they can run circles around so many MCs, even of the time. That said, when this album actually does get a little bit more serious and topic-focused, like on Vaxicran, MedicineGoDown, which focuses on the hard reality of living with the pharmaceutical regimen required to survive if you're HIV positive, or the frustration of being constantly, actively marginalized on the closing track Burnout, or even just the outright annoyance of the scene as they co-opt and flip hip-hop slang on Straighttrippin, probably the most recognizable song here, they show the unique value of a queer perspective in that space. And enough of the sentiments are trying to be forward-thinking that they could well hold up today. And again, these guys are great rappers. That being said, the mechanisms of parody do come through on this project, and it's hard not to get the impression that there are hooks and tones chosen specifically to sound a little grating or annoying, like the hook on Grammatology, or how the interlude on Off the Hook basically collapses for a phone call that is kind of peripheral and honestly seems a little bit obnoxious. And this is where the conversation necessarily gets a bit more tricky, because for as much as this album is clearly built for MCs just to spit first and build songs later, it does mean that there's a bit of a shaggy, haphazard quality to the project that doesn't quite help its flow or overall construction or cohesion. Some of this does have to do with the mixing. The vocal and percussion layering can be a little bit slipshod and inconsistent, especially on Writer's Retreat. And while I do like the West Coast appropriation of a native tongue sample back sound, that's right up my alley, it's not always consistent where it works. I mean, the horns across Cologne on Funk, they sound great, but the flat synth keening across a run-on, across the scratches, didn't quite hit the way they should, and some of the attempts at falsetto singing could sound a little bit flat. More importantly, as much as all three MCs maintain a distinctive flow and style, I struggle to like the guest star G-Minus's more jerky, shuddering cadence in comparison with the smoother vibes the main trio could deliver. And even with them, you could tell that there are some kinks that need to be ironed out. And while that is to be expected, as I said earlier, this was a debut built out of frustration in a scene where you can tell it was more important to help curate and cultivate the vintage hip-hop vibe rather than chase hits, and their disdain for Billboard is actively brought up on the album. It does mean there's a lot here to swallow in one sitting, so to speak. And perhaps better sequencing or more attempts at structure could have led to a project that doesn't feel so much of its time. And that's the funny thing about BourgieBohoPostPomoAfroHomo, because while I like this album, I understand the factors behind its creation, and that Deep Dickollective would develop into a more consistent group on future projects that could play to the Peace Out Queer Hip Hop Festival throughout the 2000s, and thanks to the genesis of the internet, which allowed LGBT acts to communicate outside of hubs like the Bay Area or New York, it laid a lot of the groundwork for hip-hop's progressive steps this decade, even as Peace Out would close and Deep Dickollective would disband around the end of the 2000s, and all the members would return to academia in some form. Again, we're talking about very highly educated guys. But you know, like when I covered the Dicks last year, even with the onset of the internet, there's just been so much history that's been lost. There were already gaping holes in the legacy of underground hip-hop full of defunct web pages and grainy video, stereo and tough audio to make out. But when you consider a marginalized space where there are already gaping holes in the history thanks to losses due to the AIDS epidemic, all the more prevalent coming out of the 90s, I'm just happy I could find a Bandcamp page where you could get their greatest hits compilation and I could get some of the credits behind some of these songs. But as for this album specifically, look, you don't need to tell me that it's niche upon niche, and very much of its time, and then that it is absolutely flawed. But I would also argue it's worth hearing, it's worth preserving, especially as it is a subset of fiercely lyrical and progressive hip-hop I guarantee that many of you probably don't even know existed. And honestly, I'll say this, a fair few of these songs could speak to that community now and do really effectively well. And just the existence within the space has a ton of value. And really, just as the historical document and being able to speak to a more progressive viewpoint going forward, they didn't really need to cater to the audience that was going to wind up getting left behind anyway. So why should they? They didn't. They were uncompromising, and I really respect that. I respect the provocation of this album more than anything. And as such, I'm giving it a very strong 7 out of 10, and if you're looking for a side of Pride that is long overlooked, I can see you having a lot of fun with this. So yeah, great stuff. Check it out. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Amazingly, I actually found places where you could buy and stream this album, so links down there below. And I got the poll up there. I'm curious if you guys bother to hear it. What do you think about it? Because it is defiantly unique in comparison with a lot of the underground hip-hop I've explored through this series of Resonators thus far. So yeah, definitely curious what you think on this one. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. Looking for the episode of Billboard Breakdown dropping tomorrow. It's in the link right over here. All social media is down in the description below as well. And also keep in mind, got a new episode of The Trailing Edge and a pretty busy schedule on the line, so you want to subscribe? Happy to see you guys come back. But till then, I'm Mark. You're watching Resonators on Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.